September 20th, 1944, somewhere outside Cherbourg, France. The cold morning mist rolled low across the Normandy hedgerows, clinging to boots, crawling up the ankles of men who weren't supposed to be here. A convoy of trucks, 6 GMC CCKWs and a fuel tanker, rumbled down the narrow country road, their canvas flaps streaked with mud, their engines throbbing with mechanical indifference. In the back of the third truck, Auberginier Franz Becker sat in silence, wrists bound with rough American rope, his uniform stained with weeks of dust and failure. The iron cross on his lapel was gone, ripped off by a paratrooper at Cairnton. His glasses had cracked on the left lens. His boots were American now, 2 worn combat soles, taken from the pile of field salvage. Across from him, 2 other German engineers, Kruger and Mainhardt, sat equally silent, hunched, eyes sunken. They didn't speak, not out of discipline, out of disbelief. France had seen how the Americans fought, brutally efficient, but he had told himself it was temporary, that the Allies were stretched thin, that the Wehrmacht's counteroffensive was coming. But then came the camp. Not a prison, not yet. They were being moved, processed. And yet what he saw in that first staging yard outside Utah Beach had shaken him more than any artillery barrage or dogfight. It wasn't tanks. It wasn't planes. It was the parts. That yard, barely a quarter-mile wide, held more industrial might than France had seen in the entire Atlantic Wall sector he'd worked for the last 3 years. Crates stacked 12 high, labeled in thick black stencil, spare, wrenches, generators, STRUTS, brake drums. There were tools, reamers, torque wrenches, socket sets, arranged not in boxes but in rows like vegetables at market. Some were still wrapped in oil cloth. Others had been left in the open, as if their value was meaningless. He had blinked, mistaken them at first for construction supplies. Surely they weren't for repair. Surely they weren't throwing these things away. But then the American corporal had said it, casual, offhanded. Yeah, we don't fix those. Easier to swap the whole housing. Takes 5 minutes, just toss the rest. Toss. France had spent 6 months overseeing gearbox repairs on German light armor in Brittany. Rationed parts, stripped bearings, screws cleaned and rethreaded because new ones were too precious to spare. Toss. He hadn't spoken since. The truck bounced on a rut, snapping him back to the present. Kruger muttered something in low Saxon dialect. France didn't answer. Ahead the road turned, and the convoy slowed. They were arriving. Not at a prison, at something else. A logistics depot. And what they saw there would make the yard at Utah Beach seem like a child's toolbox. The truck turned off the road, wheels grinding against gravel. Ahead, beneath a rising tree line, opened what looked like a vast steel-end canvas city. Tents, platforms, stacked pallets, mechanical bays. Forklifts and cranes moved like insects across the clearing, each hauling crates the size of Volkswagens. The Americans had not merely brought supplies. They had brought a civilization of maintenance. And now the Germans would see it up close. A tall MP banged on the side panel. Everybody out. France stumbled down, blinking in the light. The sky was overcast, but he still raised a hand against it. The scale of the operation hit him immediately. A bulldozer, an honest-to-God Caterpillar D7, roared past them pulling a sled loaded with mobile lathe units. On the far end, a hangar tent was being filled with transmission assemblies, neatly categorized, each tagged with type, date, serial number, and unit compatibility. He stared. Not 1, not 10, hundreds. A young American with a clipboard passed by, barely glancing at the prisoners. He called out, "Move those power packs to Station 3. They're rescheduling the motor pool swap for the 6th Armored, and we need pre-cleared torque specs logged before 700. Torque specs pre-cleared. Kruger looked at France. His face had gone pale. These weren't just spare parts. This was a supply doctrine built on the assumption that everything could be broken, and that everything could be replaced instantly. And to France, raised in a war machine where a broken pump meant a 48-hour halt, where soldering a cracked housing in the dark was an act of necessity and faith, it was like walking into a future that did not believe in scarcity. He saw a pile of carburetors dumped beside a field table, dozens, maybe more, still shiny with grease. "Those are still good," he muttered, speaking aloud for the first time in days. No one heard him. Then a crane operator shouted, "Scrap piles full. Dump the extras behind the fuel bladder and get ready for the Bradley kits." The carburetors were scooped like trash. France felt his stomach churn. He tried to speak again but found no words. And then the officer arrived. An American logistics captain, barely 30, clipboard in hand, khakis spotless, voice clipped and calm. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing them in fluent German, "you'll be assisting in parts tracking and tool inventory. You'll be under guard, but you'll be fed. Don't touch classified items, don't wander, work fast. We turn over 60 tons of equipment daily, and I expect you to keep up." France blinked. 60 tons. Mainhart whispered, "That can't be correct." But it was. They were marched to a sorting table, handed clipboards, and put to work. Within the first hour, France logged 118 spark plug units, 53 water pumps, 19 sealed field radios, and 2,100.30 caliber barrel brushes. All tagged for delivery to units across France, all logged to arrive in 72 hours or less. He stared down at the clipboard, at the list of part numbers and destinations. Then he looked at his hands, still stained with the grease of a dying Reich. And he understood. They had never had a chance. The steel clipboard clattered onto the workbench as France leaned over it, breath shallow. Every few minutes, another truck backed into the depot's west platform, unloading more crates. The crates held parts. Then the parts had parts. Bolts packed with washers, gaskets nested in padded sleeves, some so precise they came with tiny paper guides describing torque values and alignment arrows. Every item had a use. Every tool had a designated destination. And no one seemed to count the cost. France tried not to stare. He tried to focus on the inventory forms in front of him, but the numbers filled his vision like noise. He wasn't just counting stock anymore. He was cataloging a civilization. The depot ran like a small country. There were radio stations tied to supply lines, a generator bank with triple redundancy, refrigeration tents for chemical compounds, and even a mobile print press hammering out updated field manuals on lubrication schedules. By midday, the engineers had been relocated to a bench near what the Americans called Section Delta. It was a tire bay, stacked not with tires in the sense France knew them, but whole wheels, rims, treads, tubes, balanced and marked with rotation life. A corporal with grease under every fingernail gestured to them casually. "Every one of these is pre-balanced and numbered," he said, flipping his wrench in the air as he spoke. "Unit loses a wheel, we don't patch, we replace the whole thing, quicker, safer." Kruger blinked, "All of them, even if the puncture is minor." The corporal shrugged, "We've got plenty, rubber ain't rare for us." They moved on, past a lathe operator spinning out standardized shims for tank suspension mounts. Each shim took maybe 90 seconds to produce. France counted. The man was already on his 9th by the time they rounded the next stack of pallets. And then came the spark plug bay. A full tent, maybe 60 feet long, lined with labeled drawers. Each drawer was organized by plug diameter, thread pitch, heat range, resistance class. Mainhart whispered, "Why would infantry need this many plug types?" Another American answered without being asked. "Artillery, jeeps, trucks, tanks, gensets, welders, aircraft, tugs, everything we run uses an engine. Engines need plugs. You want to sort them." France could only nod. They worked for hours and yet never made a dent. The parts just kept coming, some from depots in Cherbourg, others off ships rerouted from Le Havre. One crate, marked Birmingham Al, was still warm from its trip through the logistical arteries of the U.S. war machine. The rhythm of it all became hypnotic. Sort. Label. Stack. Sort again. At first, France thought it was overkill, until he began to see the pattern. Every label had a date, a location, and a unit. Every date matched a future. These weren't spares waiting for a breakdown. These were parts assigned to things that hadn't broken yet. Preventive logistics. He sat down on a crate near sundown, his legs aching, brain fogged. He stared at a single tag from a gearbox he had just catalogued. It read, M3 HALFTRACK, 42 ND Armored, replace Enfield ETA, Sept 22 ND. It was September 20th. They were pre-staging for breakdowns, not yet reported. Kruger sat beside him, his mouth dry. What would we be capable of if we had this? France didn't answer, because he knew the answer. It wouldn't matter, the Reich could never replicate this, not even close. The Americans weren't just supplying their men, they were predicting failure and beating it there. A guard passed by and tossed them a water canteen. France took it and drank without resistance. Whatever pride he had clung to in Brest was gone now. This wasn't defeat by tanks or bombs. This was defeat by socket sets and spare timing belts. He looked across the depot and saw one of the forklifts reloading a broken portable compressor onto a flatbed. The compressor was still functional. It could be repaired. But the Americans didn't bother. A new one was already waiting. Mainhart came back from a tool bay, holding something wrapped in oiled canvas. He opened it carefully, revealing a set of micrometers and measuring gauges, precision tools worth a fortune in German factories. France reached out and touched one. He remembered borrowing a micrometer from another unit once. It had taken 2 weeks to arrive. There were 50 in the drawer. He leaned back against the crate, staring at the tent roof. Somewhere back in Magdeburg, he'd once argued with his factory director about tightening machining tolerances on tank barrels. The man had said, "We can't tighten specs unless we increase inspection tools, and we can't do that unless the FURA sends us more dial gauges." Here every forward repair team had gauges, in pouches, clipped to belts like pencils. And so, slowly, something else began to settle over Franz Becker. Not just shock, not just technical awe. Resentment. The Reich had promised glory, had sent men with medals and flags to die in Russia and Africa and now France, but it had not given them this. This was what war required, not slogans, not radio speeches. You needed 3 4-inch wrenches. You needed 12 extra bearings for every gearbox. You needed to assume the worst and plan for more. The Americans didn't just do that, they did it at scale. And they did it casually. The next day, the engineers were reassigned to the tire washing station, where field-recovered wheels were cleaned, sorted, and requalified. It was menial, but gave them a vantage point over most of the depot. That morning they watched 3 new trailers arrive. Not trucks, trailers, pulled by 6-ton tractors. The first held replacement leaf springs, each wrapped in protective cloth, stamped, tagged, and scheduled for use in Belgium. The second was full of ignition systems. The third held nothing but hammers, crates and crates of hammers. France asked the guard, "Why so many?" The man shrugged. "They break and they're cheap, why bother fixing one?" Kruger shook his head. "We use the same hammer for months, sometimes years." The guard laughed. "We lose 'em before they wear out, but the trucks keep coming." He gestured toward the northern road. "Tomorrow there'll be more." France looked at the convoy route. still muddy from yesterday's deliveries. And that's when he finally understood. They hadn't been captured by an army. They'd been captured by a system. A rolling, wrench-turning, infinitely resupplied system. And once that system got moving, there was no stopping it. On the third day, the depot expanded. Not by blueprint, not by design, just by momentum. New trucks arrived that didn't stop. The convoy lanes grew muddy with tread lines deeper than a man's knees. Portable floodlights lit the depot perimeter at night like a small city. And somewhere around 400, a bulldozer carved out an entirely new quadrant just to hold engine overhauls that couldn't be parked with the others due to overflow. Overflow. Franz Becker stood on the catwalk of the oil bay and watched the forklifts move crates tagged spare, spare, spare. He couldn't keep track of what was being replaced anymore. It didn't matter. Kruger leaned beside him, a wrench dangling in his hand. We've entered something else, something beyond logic. Franz didn't answer. He knew what Kruger meant. They had passed beyond the realm of strategy, tactics, even production. This scale of replacement was an economic phenomenon, not a military one. Everywhere he looked, redundancy overflowed. The same spark plug crates, the same tire assemblies, the same toolkits, dozens of identical kits, each packed with the same old cloth, the same wrench alignment, the same pre-calibrated torque drivers. It was as though they didn't care about waste. Except there was no waste, only certainty. A new group of POWs, mechanics from a captured Panzer repair team, had arrived the night before. France had watched one of them approach an American sergeant and gesture toward a table filled with brake drums. The German had pointed at a cracked one and offered to machine it back into service. The sergeant laughed. "Why, that's a half-hour job. We've got 20 new ones." The mechanic hadn't replied. He just stood there, holding the cracked brake drum in his hands like a relic. France now understood that man's silence. They were called that afternoon to assist at the mobile motor pool. Mainhart was assigned to a Jeep repair bay, logging units that came in with radiator damage and left with completely new assemblies. Not repairs, replacements, full swaps. France and Kruger were sent to assist with something labeled Triage Group D. It sounded like medicine. It was. Group D was tasked with sorting the unsortable, items broken, burned, seized, or too damaged to reintegrate. But even that process ran like a factory line. Damaged alternators went left, fried radios went center, frame-cracked carburetors went right. Behind each station was a replacement line, new parts already waiting for the next convoy to carry them forward. Nothing slowed, nothing paused. Even the forklifts had a system. When their batteries ran low, they didn't charge them. They swapped battery packs with fresh ones from crates labeled Forklift, BAT, STD. France had spent most of 1943 trying to get 3 forklift units in Brest to stay operable. He'd pulled teeth trying to find a replacement coil once. Here, they changed batteries like boots. Later that evening, a young American tech from Arkansas taught Kruger how to use a pneumatic ratchet. The tool hissed and whirred with effortless speed, bolts flying off a chassis in seconds. Kruger dropped the tool after the 5th bolt and muttered, "It feels like cheating." The American laughed. "Cheating's losing, this is winning." The statement lingered in the air. By the 5th day, the engineers no longer spoke at meals. Each had seen a different aspect of the depot that changed them. Mainhart had spent the afternoon in a tent that held nothing but power inverters, hundreds of them. Most had never been unboxed. Kruger had helped unload 1,200 pounds of spare treads for Sherman tanks, each marked by batch, metallurgy code, and assigned unit. The treads were organized by anticipated failure window. France had been called into the typewriting station. He thought it was a punishment. It was. He was told to type inventory reports, basic work. But the typewriters were new, fast, all-American. As he typed, he realized something. The depot didn't just replace parts. It replaced communication, tracking, signatures. Every request, every transfer, every repair was logged and mapped in triplicate. The tools weren't just mechanical. They were clerical. Every officer knew what was where, who needed it, and when it would arrive. It was what he always dreamed of having in Magdeburg, only there it was science fiction. Here it was a daily rhythm. He dropped the sheet and looked around. A replacement typewriter waited on the shelf behind him, just in case. At dusk, they were escorted to the outskirts of the depot, toward a row of vehicles lined up for salvage. They thought they were walking into a junkyard, but these weren't wrecks. They were just done. France counted 7 jeeps, 5 half-tracks, 2 M5 tractors. Some had minor damage, others had none at all. One half-track had been pulled out of service simply because its radio was faulty, and its track tensioner made noise at high speed. Rather than fix it, they had sent a new one. This one would be stripped, its parts packed, and used to support something else. The Americans weren't running a repair shop. They were running a feedback loop. A system so large that machines flowed in and out like cells in a living body. Some to the front, some back for organs, some ground down and recycled for parts. And nothing ever slowed down. That night, France walked alone for a few minutes near the tent where they slept. He passed a shed filled with toolboxes, standard issue, khaki painted, everyone with full sets. He passed a table stacked with fuel line clips, small, stamped uniform. There had to be thousands. And then he passed the crate labeled axle bearing sets, slotted M3 M5 1944B batch, scheduled repl. Scheduled, replacements scheduled, bearings that hadn't failed yet. He stopped walking. There in that silent moment, Franz Becker, once a proud engineer of the German Reich, felt something deeper than shame. He felt irrelevance. He had spent years mastering the art of making do, of squeezing efficiency from scarcity, of improvising under fire. And here was a war machine that had never even heard of scarcity. He turned slowly and looked out over the depot. The crane still moved, the lights still burned. And somewhere in the distance, another convoy rolled toward them. With more crates, more parts, more tools, as if the system was eternal. And for the first time, Franz Becker wondered not how the war would end, but how it had ever lasted this long. The morning France woke to diesel engines already running. He didn't sit up. He just listened. There was a rhythm to the American convoys now. He could sense them by the sound alone. The long rumble of 6x6 trucks, the higher whine of a jeep, the clank of a tank hauler or a treaded cargo sled moving across steel planks laid over the softer earth. He hadn't seen the front in nearly 2 weeks, but he didn't need to. The war was still being fought, yes, but in this place the war was being fed. That morning the depot's western bay opened its newest wing, a steel-framed structure with a corrugated roof, twice the length of a tennis court. Its function wasn't posted. No guards stood outside, but inside something different was happening. France and Kruger were ordered in to assist with categorization. The moment they stepped through the flap, France stopped cold. The building wasn't for parts, not just tools. It was a packaging line. But not for food. For tools. Each bay contained rows of open-top crates, where young American corporals packed standardized toolkits into padded slots, pliers, drivers, ratchets, sockets, every tool exact, sterile, positioned like medical instruments. A checklist came with each one, clipped to the lid. Every kit had a name. Not a serial number, a name. Armor Repair Kit, Forward Series B. Engineer Kit, Field Type Mild Climate. Radio tool set, Tech SGT, truck-mounted stations only. There were dozens of variations, each tailored to a role, each standardized for instant swap. Kruger muttered, "They've modularized maintenance." France nodded slowly. "This isn't a depot, this is a doctrine." Behind them, a sergeant barked orders. Bay 3, switch from cold weather infantry kits to Sherman track adjustment kits. 3rd Armored sent in a request last night and the requisitions approved. Let's move. France had to ask, when is the kit needed? The sergeant didn't blink. Yesterday. That day they didn't count parts. They didn't log damaged equipment. They prepped replacements for things already en route to break. Kruger read aloud from a manifest. Torque bars, load bearing class 2, shipment destination Luxembourg, forward repair site, request date October 3rd. France froze. It's September. No, not anymore. At lunch, the German engineers were given half an hour. They didn't eat with the Americans. They ate on the concrete beside the tire stacks, in the shadow of a fuel bladder the size of a house. Mainhart sat cross-legged, chewing slowly, staring at the sky. "They don't ration tool use," he said quietly. "They don't scold mechanics for breaking things. They assume it'll happen, and they just plan past it." France nodded. "We punish our sergeants for part failure. We treat it as incompetence." Kruger wiped his hands on his pants. "They treat it like gravity." In the evening they passed through the scrap yard again. It had changed. What was once a place of cast-offs was now a sorting system of its own. The scrap wasn't ignored. It was stripped, melted, remolded, and in some cases reissued, not to fix the past, but to feed the future. The Americans recycled not because they lacked, but because they could afford to reinvest. It was the final layer of the system. Nothing slowed down, not even waste. The next morning, they saw the aviation wing. Not planes, but what kept them flying. France had assumed the air logistics line would be minimal, managed separately. Instead, it was larger than the vehicle maintenance area. A tent the size of a cathedral housed engine assemblies for P-47 Thunderbolts, magneto spares, stripped turbochargers, fuel filters in sealed bags. There were torque shafts and aluminum cowling mounts stacked in racks as if they weighed nothing. A single aircraft engine, assembled glistening, was being lifted by a crane. Mainhart stopped and stared. "That's new, unused." An American mechanic shrugged. "Yeah, the old one still runs, but the colonel wants it changed anyway." "Why?" He smirked. "Preventative maintenance. Schedule says it's due." France closed his eyes. They were retiring engines before failure, just because. Later that night, Kruger said what none of them wanted to admit. "This is what it looks like when a nation doesn't just outfight you, it outbuilds you, outrepairs you, outplans your defeat before you even step onto the battlefield." France stared at his hands again, calloused, cut, still dirty under the nails. He remembered writing reports to Berlin begging for parts in 1943. He remembered soldering ignition wires with a heated spoon in a barn outside Caen. He remembered using paper soaked in grease as a filter when proper spares failed to arrive. Here they threw out spark plugs that hadn't been used yet. By the 10th day, the Americans allowed them to move freely within the depot perimeter. Not as trust, just as a matter of efficiency. Prisoners with skills were faster when unguarded. France wandered into the radio bay without orders. It was a tent packed with signal units, vacuum tubes, antenna kits, and stacks of batteries. A single soldier was wiring a long whip antenna to a half-track. He saw France watching and grinned. "You from over there?" the soldier asked, gesturing east. France nodded once. "We found a busted transmitter near Falaise. Must have been one of yours." He pointed to a table. There it was. A German radio, dented, cracked, one knob missing. We're trying to salvage the crystal. Yours are good. France stepped closer. It was his Unit S, from 2 months ago. Do you repair these? The soldier shook his head. No, too slow. Ours are modular now. Toss the old, slot in new, faster. France whispered, what do you do with the broken ones? The soldier shrugged. Recycling unit maybe, or training aids, doesn't really matter, got more coming tomorrow. He walked out slowly. The air smelled of hot grease, ozone, coffee. Everywhere around him tools clanged, engines started, new parts arrived. And suddenly he understood that the war wasn't being won on the beaches, or in the skies, or even in the trenches. It was being won here. In the systems. In the parts. In the belief that anything could be rebuilt, not later, not eventually, but now. Instantly. America didn't fear the machine breaking. They planned for it. And then they beat it. Franz Becker no longer asked how many spare parts came in each day. He had stopped counting. It wasn't because he'd grown used to it. It was because it had become like tracking rainfall in a storm. You didn't measure it anymore. You just braced yourself and tried to stay upright. By the third week, his team was working near the intake checkpoint. He was now trusted to assist with processing incoming crates. The logs no longer came in single sheets. They came in rolls, yards of paper printed by teletype, with item numbers, destinations, and forward unit codes punched onto each line like clockwork. One day, a crate arrived mislabeled. It contained a set of hydraulic piston arms meant for tank recovery vehicles. The issue wasn't the parts, it was the font size on the label, too small for quick scanning. Before he could say anything, a corporal had already called over a junior logistics officer. The crate was flagged, the mistake recorded, and within minutes, a replacement label was printed and fixed. No reprimand, no chaos. Just correction, systematic, instant, impersonal. France stared at the officer. He couldn't have been older than 22, but he ran that sector like a rail yard conductor. Not one part moved without his sign-off. And still, the system ran ahead of him. One evening, the engineers were given a break, not time off, but a change of task. They were invited, ordered, technically, to attend a demonstration. It took place in a canvas hangar at the depot's eastern edge, beside a clearing where the mobile mess had been set up for rotating shifts. Inside, 2 American warrant officers stood beside a disassembled tank engine, M4 Sherman class, surrounded by 30 soldiers. The officers began the demonstration with calm authority. This engine's been pulled due to suspected pressure loss in cylinder 3. Rather than test and rebuild, we swap in a new block. We'll use components from standard inventory. Time to completion, 1 hour. They did it in 47 minutes. France timed it. New block, new gaskets, all torqued to spec with calibrated tools. The soldiers worked like machinists, not mechanics. Every movement was rehearsed. The engine roared to life before the hour was over. Someone applauded. The American soldiers smiled but didn't seem impressed. They were used to it. France and the others said nothing. Kruger said it later, outside the tent. If we had that engine in 42, it would have taken 3 days, if we had the parts. Mainhart nodded, and if not, we'd have pulled one off a wreck and prayed it still spun. But here, prayer had been replaced by inventory. The psychological toll wasn't something anyone spoke of, but it hovered in the background like smoke. Every German in the depot had once been a believer. In engineering, in precision, in German superiority. They weren't cowards, they weren't naive, they'd seen battle, but they had also believed that their craftsmanship was unmatched. Until now. Every day in the depot eroded that belief like acid. Not because the Americans built better machines, but because they could build endlessly. And rebuild. And swap. and moved forward without stopping to mourn a breakdown. One night near midnight, France stepped away from the sleeping tent and walked alone past the dispatch lane. The depot was never quiet. Diesel engines rumbled, crates shifted, lights hummed. He passed the outbound staging zone. 3 M10 tank destroyers waited for pickup. One had a scuffed fender. Another had some carbon fouling near the exhaust. Nothing critical. Yet each had been pulled, cleaned, fitted with new internal systems, and was already scheduled for return to the front within 36 hours. Not because someone begged, not because paperwork had been escalated, but because the system demanded nothing less. He sat down on the edge of the staging dock and looked out toward the horizon. For the first time in weeks, he thought of Germany, not in slogans or flags or parades, but in steel. He thought of trains delayed by single parts, of cooling systems sabotaged by Allied bombing runs, of factories with no rubber, of tanks frozen in place for lack of bearings. And then he thought of this place, where crates of hammers arrived daily, where an engine wasn't a treasure, it was an expendable asset, where a wrench had a serial number and a replacement code. The next morning, they were told they'd be transferred. Not to another depot, not to a labor camp. Back to a processing station for formal interrogation. The Americans wanted their engineering knowledge, not for sabotage, for analysis. France packed his things, what little he had, his old Wehrmacht notebook, a copy of Heinkel's specifications, the stub of a pencil. As they waited for the truck, the American officer they had worked under stepped forward. He shook their hands, calmly, even respectfully. "You worked well," he said, "efficient, smart." France looked him in the eye. "I hope it helps." The officer didn't smile. "It already has." Then he added, "If it's any consolation, this machine of ours, it runs because we assume everything will break. That's our secret, not invincibility, acceptance." France nodded. "And you built past it?" "Yes." They left. Weeks later, during interrogation near Reims, France was shown diagrams of Allied production rates, charts of replacement cycles, American steel output, fuel delivery schedules. He recognized the scale. But the depot had already shown him the truth. Numbers on paper didn't capture it. What captured it was a crate full of socket wrenches labeled extra. Not spare, not emergency. Just extra. Because they could. Because there would always be more. And because that, more than any gun or tank, was why they had lost.